Hey Wargamers, Doug here from 2+ Stuff, and last week I was hard at work flexing some new mental muscles when it came to writing rules, which is something I don't usually do quite often. And the product of all of that was the Lonesome Road expansion for Warcry. And this is my take of basically doing a one-player Warcry game. It's simply put, it's just a rule set that governs the AI, so to speak, the computer, sort of, that dictates how your opponent plays in a given game. And if you're like me, just reading the rules makes it kind of hard to conceptualize how something can work. And so in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to play the Lonesome Road expansion. And the reason I wanted to do this is because the videos coming out after this are going to be a Warcry campaign featuring my Corvus Cabal, the Dusk Talons, as they play through an actual campaign with a big story arc of setting the city of Carnage into civil war. It's going to be pretty cool, but the games in that are going to be using the Lonesome Road rules, and so if people have questions, I wanted to put this video out there to give you some direction on just how this will all work. With that out of the way, let's go into the tutorial. So to play the Lonesome Road expansion, you will need everything that you normally do for Warcry. That is, terrain, rules, measuring tape, and dice, as well as 2 warbands. Now, for the warband that you're going to be playing, you will specifically need the cards and the abilities for them. My original idea behind this was to play a full campaign, but single-player games work just as well, and that's the example we'll be walking through today. And it's important to note up top here that most of this expansion builds on what already exists in the Warcry rules, and so what I'm going to do is walk through the process of setting up a game as per the core rulebooks. I'm going to point out the differences from this expansion as we go. So when it comes to setting up a game, you will need your warband roster or a legal 1K list if you are playing a matched play. The AI, as we're going to call it, can use whatever kind of list you want to create. You can make it full of, squigs if you want to have a narrative adventure where they're in a squig cave, or you can make it an equally, fearsome warband for matched play. You as the player will then split your warband into 3 pieces, just like you normally would. You would split it into the hammer, the shield, and the dagger. But you never quite know what your opponent is going to do on the same note, how they're going to split up their little warband. And so here's how the steps go for deciding how your opponent, the AI, splits up their warband. For each model in the warband, roll a die. And this is going to be a D3, so your results are going to be 1 through 3. Split them up into these groups. So you have all the things that rolled a 1, all the things that rolled a 2 and a 3, all split up into the various groups. The group that is the largest is instantly your shield. Doesn't matter if the leader's in it or not. If there's a tie, simply roll off to decide which one is the shield. Next, just pick one of the 2 other groups and roll a die to decide if that's the hammer. Simply say, hey, on a 4-up, this one is the hammer, and boom, there you go. Now you do still have to follow the core rules that say every battle group here has to have at least 1 model in it. If that's the case, where either your hammer or your dagger do not have a model in it whatsoever, simply take 1 model at random. You can roll for it or choose, it depends on what you want to do, from one of those groups and put it in the other. And thus you have created 3 distinct battle groups. Your biggest one is the shield, you have a hammer, and a dagger. Now the next part of the core rules when it comes to setting up a game is you draw your cards. Your terrain card, deployment card, both of those things happen as normal. The only difference is that when it comes to deployment cards, you are always red. If you don't know, on deployment cards for Warcry, there's red and blue deployment territories. You're always going to be red. Where things get a little bit different is when it comes to the victory and twist cards. That is to say, the mission that you're fighting for and the twist that complicates it. To create a fun experience that works well with this AI program, I've curated a list from the available decks that we have for your victory card and twist cards. Simply limit the victory and twist cards to the options that I have listed out here, and you'll be all set. This way you can draw them randomly just like you normally would, but you now know that every mission you're going to get works with this setup. Now, one little thing I want to put on the end here is the idea of objectives. We all understand that some of these missions have us moving towards objectives. This is specific points on the map or treasures or things like that. However, when a victory condition identifies that, say, kill the enemy warband's leader, well, for the purposes of this rules document, we're going to consider the leader the objective in this scenario. Likewise, if it says you must eliminate, for example, all of the dagger from your opponent's warband, all the models within your opponent's dagger become objectives. And that applies to any of the rules that we talk about down below. Now the game is actually set up. You have a board, you have a mission, you have a twist, you have all these things, an opposing warband, you're split up and deployed. We're going to move into the hero phase. You roll your initiative dice as normal. You also get your wild die as normal, but now you have an extra decision to make with it. You see, the AI is not going to roll their initiative dice. Instead, you're going to roll a single die to determine initiative. On a 4-up, you get initiative. However, you can, if you'd like to, spend your wild die or any of the ones that you have banked to give you +1 to that roll. The reason for this is because the AI does not use abilities, but we'll get to what makes up for that deficiency later on. This also gives you an opportunity to try and get the upper hand in combat, which sometimes you just need. Everything with your initiative dice works the exact same that you see in the core rulebook. You know, you turning a single into a double with a wild die, splitting them up to doubles, triples, quads, things like that. It's all the exact same. And of course, you can bank your wild die as many as you'd like. Now we're going to move into the combat phase, which is really the bulk of the game, of course. And this is very simple. There's really 3 things you have to do to make enemy models activate, and that is determine which model to activate, roll to see what their behavior is, and lastly, follow through with it. When it comes to determining who to activate, you're always going to pick the enemy model that is closest to any of your fighters currently on the table. If there are 2 or more, like first example, if you're in combat, you're going to use the following priorities to determine who goes first. The leader of the AI will always fight first, followed by the most expensive unit. You're going to do that in descending order, right? Whoever's the most expensive next to the hero, they get to fight next. If all the units are tied in terms of their points cost, the ones with the fewest wounds remaining will fight. That is their last desperate struggle to get in a blow before they're killed. And if all of that fails and you still have a tie between 2 available fighters that can fight, you roll a die to randomize it. Keep in mind, this is just for the AI. You get to choose whatever models you want. So let's go through an example here. Here we have one poor member of the Corvus Cabal surrounded by 3 iron golems. This model is the leader and so will fight first, followed by the big boy in the back because he's the next most expensive model. Lastly, this little grunt here will fight, and if there were 2 little grunts who were tied on wounds, you then roll a die to randomize it. And I'll give one more example here. Here I have 2 fighters, I separated them off, and of course remember this whole time you are alternating activations with you and the AI of course, so you can do whatever you want. The AI has followed this strict program. So in this example, the hero over here to the left would fight first against that little Kabbalist. Then I, as the Corvus Cabal player, would do whatever action I wanted to do, followed by Big Red, because he is the next most expensive, and then the little grunt. And this is how it would play out, because these 3 fighters of the Iron Golems are all equally far away from models from your warband. So now that we've determined who to activate, we're going to look at the behavior table and determine what they do. So let's move to a different example. Now we have a very clear 1-to-1 fight. And we're going to assume that this Iron Golems fighter is being controlled by the AI and it's their turn. You pick a fighter to activate, and then you measure the distance between them and the nearest fighter from your warband. On the Lonesome Road rule sheet, you'll see a little chart that has different measurements on it, and you're basically just going to roll a die from whichever column matches, kind of where you're at in terms of distance. So for example, if you're within 1 inch of an enemy, if you're between 1 inch and 12 inches, or if you're more than 12 inches away, that's how you can tell which chart to roll on. And so now the rest of this video is just going to be showing you examples of how the various, behaviors work. The most basic of them all is press the attack. You make 1 move action and then 1 attack action. Now it's important to note here that you do stop whenever you come into weapon range. And if you are in weapon range when you roll for press the attack, instead of moving and attacking, you just attack. The reason for this ruling is simply because you don't want archer units who have these great ranged attacks that are very valuable moving into combat where they can get crushed very easily. So to give you an example here, Now this Iron Golem's fighter has a 3-inch ranged weapon on her melee. She's going to move, but she's not going to go into base-to-base contact. She's going to move as close as she can to get into attack position. Likewise, if somebody was wielding a bow and arrow, they wouldn't walk up to their target. They would just move as far as they needed to get in range and then shoot. And of course, if they start their activation in range of one of their weapons, they would just attack. And this applies to any ranged attack, whether it has a minimum distance value or not. So for example, this Necromancer, his lightning shocks do not work within 3 inches, but that doesn't matter. He's going to end his movement right there and shoot from his hands. Now, the next behavior is called Conan, which works almost identically to press the attack. The difference is when you go to move, you're going to move towards an objective. Now, I mentioned before, objectives can be fighters, they can be large swaths of the board, or they can be specific points. And just like press the attack, if they start that behavior in melee range of somebody, they're just going to attack. Next up is Spooked, and this is very simple. They're just going to make a disengage action directly away from whatever fighters they're in combat with and end their activation. This happens rarely, but sometimes the oppressive fear of the 8 points is just too much for some warriors and they fall back. Next up is Carnage, and this is one of my favorite ones, and it only happens if you are already in combat with somebody very up close and personal. But if you do roll this, the AI makes 3 attack actions, 2 normal and 1 free. Next up is Brutal Charge. This is going to be happening if you are outside of combat range, and that's for most units, but it still can bring some of those longer range units into shooting position. Essentially, you make a move action, adding 2 inches to the movement value that you do, and if it brings you into range for one of your attacks, you do take that attack action at +1 strength. So it's very much like press the attack, but you do get some advantages. A little extra movement and a little extra strength. It moves directly towards the nearest enemy model, and if you end this movement and you're not in attack range of any enemies, your activation ends. The only bonus you get for this was the extra movement. And lastly is Hurry, and this is for if you are way outside of attack range. 12 inches on these boards is quite long. And so this is simply a move action directly towards the nearest model from your warband, or if they do have a long-ranged weapon, they stop whenever they come into range and can attack if they still have an action to do so. It's important to remember you keep alternating in this manner. One of you will seize the initiative with that initial die roll in the hero phase, and for example, if you go, meaning you have the initiative, you'll conduct yourself normally, and this just dictates any time that you would let your opponent play, they're following this sequence. It may seem a bit tedious with all the measuring, however, you will find it goes very quickly. Now you may notice that I didn't list out any way for the AI to use abilities. You roll initiative dice and you can spend those to use abilities, however the computer does not. The reason for that is I tried to create a system where the built-in behaviors act as those abilities. You get bonuses, and so for example, the loss of faction-specific abilities is made up for by things like extra movement and strength when you get Brutal Charge, or triple attacks with Carnage, things like that. And so they really do make up for the fact that abilities are missing. Just go ahead and try it out. I know it's a little bit strange, but I think you'll find that it does quite well. For what it's worth, +1 strength on the charge is pretty brutal. Now I do want to note here at the end, if you do play this as a campaign system like I'm going to be doing on 2+ stuff, you will have to ignore the victory conditions for some of the convergence battles. Some of them have mission parameters and rules that happen basically outside of the twist and victory decks that I've put aside. But the reason I filtered those cards that way is simply because they work the best as a one-player format that we're going for here, where you have the most decision-making and control. You're not relying on an opponent to put down objectives or things like that, and so that's kind of why I do it. Now, not all missions are affected. There are certainly many of the campaigns that are completely unaffected, frankly, by all of this, but so just kind of be wary of that. You still do the Aftermath sequence the same. And you can use the core book Aftermath sequence. You can use the Tome of Champions 2019, like Trial of Champions, like the hard mode, so to speak. Both of those work perfectly well for this. In fact, the system is so simple because it just focuses really on what your opponent does. that any of the Warcry expansions, that means all the new terrain sets that have come out since the game's launch, the Tome of Champions, or the Trial of Champions, I should say, and monsters and mercenaries. Specifically, the mercenary part works the same. You can build an opponent's list that has a mercenary in it without any problem whatsoever. The only time it gets a little bit strange with that one is when it comes to having the AI control the monsters, right? If you want to go against a giant monster, some of their deployments and stuff like that are a little bit nuanced, and so it doesn't quite account for all of them. There are at least half of the beasts in there work just fine, and the other ones, if you are a true narrative player and you want to get a beast on your army, just tweak it a little bit, and you'll see that it's pretty easy to make these things work for the Lonesome Road. So friends, thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope that you go in the link down below, get those rules, download them, and start playing this weekend. I'm going to keep on updating it. That link goes straight to the 2+ Stuff site, so the newest edition will always be up there, and I'll make posts on my social media when I've made an update. For example, cleaning up language and options for ranged units, things like that have all come from my initial release and have been added on since, and so I will go ahead and expand those. Thank you all so much for watching. If you do have a battle report that you do, or just play one with your family and friends and you want to show them Warcry on the one-player mode, go ahead and take a picture and post on Instagram and tag me. My link is down below for that, and I'd love to see it. Thank you all so much for watching. Happy wargaming. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me, and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.